Hello, everyone. Welcome to another webinar promoted by SoftExpert. Today's event discusses about digital transformation strategies. The webinar will be conducted by Mr. Eric Kimberling, CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting Group, with extensive experience on this subject. Eric has helped hundreds of high-profile enterprises worldwide with their digital transformation initiatives. I wish you all a great webinar.
Hello and welcome to our webinar entitled Steps to an Effective 3 to 5 Year Digital Strategy. My name is Eric Kimberling with Third Stage Consulting Group. Wanted to thank you for joining here today. And just to set the context for today's conversation, one of the things that we notice when working with clients over the years is that a lot of times companies will embark on their enterprise software or ERP or CRM or general digital strategies. They'll embark on their projects without having a clear vision of where the project is headed, without clear alignment in terms of understanding how the technology initiative supports the bigger picture goals of the organization. And that's really the intent of today's webinar, is to help organizations like yourselves understand some frameworks for defining what the best 3 to 5 year strategy for your organization is. And just as a disclaimer for today, I'm not going to provide you any sorts of silver bullets or one size fits all types of answers, but instead I'm going to give you a framework that you can use to start to understand what your digital strategy is and how you can translate that into something that's aligned with your overall corporate strategy. So that's the intent of today's conversation and what we hope you'll gain from today's webinar. Before we get started, though, just a little bit about my background. Again, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting Group. I've been in the ERP and digital transformation space now for about 20 years as a consultant. So I'm a career consultant, having helped every type of organization from $50 and $100 million a year types of organizations with a CRM or a small ERP system implementation, all the way on up to Fortune 500 organizations, multi-billion-dollar organizations that are implementing SAP or Oracle or some other large ERP or digital transformation. I have Big Five consulting experience. Actually started my career at Pricewaterhouse, was there for a few years, and that's where I really learned about the ERP consulting space, particularly in the area of organizational change management and software evaluation and strategy, and a little bit of business process improvement and software selection as well, mixed in there during those first few years of my career. I was also formerly the founder and thought leader behind Panorama Consulting and other consulting teams that you may be familiar with in your careers and in your experience in the same space. And my primary competencies are focused on digital strategy, organizational change management, process improvement, project management, and also being an expert witness. That's something in the last 5 to 8 years I've been involved with, probably 25 to 30 different cases as an expert, hired to help attorneys figure out who's at fault for different types of lawsuit and breaches of contract and things like that in the ERP space. So that's a bit about my background. Again, very much focused on what we're going to talk about here today. So speaking of what we're going to talk about today, I want to start off by giving an overview of some of the objectives of today's webinar and what I hope that you'll all gain from today's session. First of all, the first objective is to understand the problems with most digital strategies. There's a common theme with digital strategic issues and problems that organizations have with executing those strategies, and I'm going to share what my experience has been with that. I also want to share how to tailor the best digital strategy for your organization. Again, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all type of answer. I'm not going to come in here and tell you that the best strategy for you is to implement a single ERP system or to implement a best of breed of technologies or to do nothing. I'm going to tell you or provide a framework that I use with clients to help them navigate the process and get to the right answer for their organizations. And then finally, I want to help learn an actionable plan for defining your digital strategy too. So that's another part of what I'll cover here today. So before I do that, though, in just getting back to the agenda, I'll talk a little bit about Third Stage Consulting here, just for a couple minutes. For those of you that don't know who we are, I'll also share a little bit about some of the common problems with digital strategies, and then we'll get into the 10 steps to a successful digital strategy. and I'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of today's session. So if you have any questions along the way, or things I don't cover, or things you'd like me to cover, or you want me to go into more detail, I'll get to the queue of questions toward the end. I won't see the questions while I'm presenting, but I'll pull those up at the end and answer as many of the questions as I can toward the end of today's session. So a little bit about Third Stage Consulting. We're a team of consulting and industry leaders. We're focused solely on client success. We're very much a client-focused organization. Now, that's one of the strategic imperatives and one of the values that we should share as an organization is really being client-focused and focused on what's best for the client, not what's best for us. We're experienced thought leaders. Many of you on the webinar today have read my stuff or attended my webinars over the years, and that's the competency that Third Stage brings to the industry, is that thought leadership and that expertise that you're not going to find from any other organization. We're 100% software, hardware, and industry agnostic too. So we don't have any sort of affiliation with any software vendors. We don't have any sorts of tie to VARs or resellers. We don't have any creative ways of making it seem like we're independent, but really we're not. We don't have any sister organizations or affiliated companies that are taking money from vendors. None of that stuff happens with Third Stage. We are 100% software, hardware, and industry agnostic. And one of the biggest things that we do is we help align corporate strategy with technology, ultimately transforming business success. So even though we're focused on digital strategy, ERP implementation, CRM implementations, and those sorts of things, we really view ourselves as business consultants and management consultants. We help companies use technology as just a tool to execute their bigger picture strategy. And of course, that's a big part of what we're talking about here today, is how do we define that strategy that can be executed by your organization. So with that as a introduction, I want to dive right into what some of the common problems are with digital strategies. And I opened up the webinar with a discussion of the experiences I've had where you work with a client and they oftentimes don't have a clear vision of what they really want the technology initiative to accomplish. Oftentimes you go into a project and you are kind of forced into it because you have an old legacy system that's no longer being supported, or that isn't going to allow your company to scale for the growth or provide the functionality you need to scale for the growth that you're expecting. So oftentimes companies and CIOs and CFOs are under the gun, so to speak, to replace that system as soon as possible. And so they end up really rushing the process and just jumping right into finding a replacement for that old system without really stepping back and looking at what is our overall strategy, what's the vision for the project, how is this going to support our longer term and bigger picture goals. And that's really the intent of defining a digital strategy, is to make sure that we've got a good framework for how we expect to move forward. And so when I look at what is the biggest problem with most digital strategies, I'd say it's misalignment. And what I mean by that is it's misalignment oftentimes with the bigger picture expectations and strategy of the company. That's first and foremost one of the biggest challenges. So, for example, a company that's looking to scale for growth and increase top line revenue, maybe they have some strategic imperatives to standardize operations across the globe. Perhaps it's to provide more improved customer service to their customers. Whatever those strategic imperatives are, oftentimes get lost in translation, get watered down, or don't make it into the expectations and intentions of a technology initiative because of what I described before, which is oftentimes those technology initiatives start because they have to. And so they kind of rush into, let's just go find some technology, let's go pick an ERP system and let's start implementing, without really thinking about, well, what is it we're actually trying to accomplish and how can this align with the bigger picture goals of the organization. So the first component of misalignment is the misalignment between the project and what the bigger picture strategy is of the organization. The other component of misalignment is just within the project itself and how it's executed, making decisions that are misaligned and not in sync with what the overall expectations for the project itself is. So oftentimes, even if you have defined a overall project strategy that supports your corporate strategy, but then you go to execute that project strategy and you start making decisions that don't align with those expectations, that creates a lot of problems too. And oftentimes this misalignment is a bigger problem than a flawed strategy. Oftentimes you'll find that, you could have a perfect strategy in mind, but if you've got misalignment, the execution is going to fail and you're not going to have a successful project. So I'd rather have an imperfect strategy, but know you've got alignment of the project and all the resources and the activities that are going to happen in that project. That's generally going to make for a more successful project than if you don't have that level of alignment. So one of the other challenges with digital strategies in general, and really any sort of ERP implementation or digital transformation or CRM implementation, some of the biggest challenges are that most of these projects don't reach what we call the third stage of success. And I look at ERP and digital transformation success in 3 stages. So the first stage is that you've got the software and partner selected, you begin the implementation, but you never really finish it. And along the way, you have a high degree of turmoil, project turnover, a lot of tension within the organization. And as a result of all that, oftentimes the project fails and you never get to the go live state, or you just get to a partial go live. And so most companies don't have a problem making it past that first stage, but where most companies get stuck is in that second stage. They get through the implementation, but they just get the real basics in place. They just simply kind of automate their old processes. They get the system up and running, but they spend more time and money than they expected. They aren't getting the benefits they expected out of the system. There's a bit of operational disruption, but it's not a total unmitigated disaster, I guess you could say. So it's more of a moderate failure. And so most companies, I'd say 80% or more, get stuck somewhere along the way, either in the first or second stage of success. And so the third stage is really where you implement as expected. You're on time, you're on budget, the ROI is realized. And most importantly, you're getting the benefits you expect, and you're getting that self-sufficiency and continuous improvement mentality embedded within the organization. So when you look at this and you think, well, why do so many companies get stuck in those first 2 stages? There's a series of best practices that they use. The ones that get to the third stage are using the same best practices and frameworks to get them there. The other 2 aren't. And so that's a big part of what we're talking about today, is what are the best practices to define a digital strategy that is aligned, that gives you the best chance for succeeding. Obviously, you're going to have to execute on that strategy, but we can at least start with a solid strategy and framework here today. And the other part of third stage that's important here is not only is it an analogy for the 3 stages of success with ERP or digital projects, but it's also a rocket launch analogy too. So when you look at, when you launch a 3-stage rocket into space, you get the first 2 boosters get you to a certain point, but then the third stage rocket is the one that separates from the other 2 and kind of launches to the ultimate height and speed that it's trying to get to. And so when you think about it, if you get bogged down by those first 2 stages and that third stage booster can't take off, that's where companies run into trouble. And so it's kind of a nice visual metaphor or analogy for ERP success as well. And that's quite frankly one of the main reasons why we named the company Third Stage, was because we focus on helping clients get to that third stage of ERP success where most others fail. So with all that being said, as a backdrop, I want to dive into the 10 steps for a successful digital strategy. And this is really the heart of today's presentation, is understanding what are the 10 steps that I can take as an organization, whether I'm a CIO, IT manager, CFO, project manager, or even if I'm a consultant to the organization, what can I do to make this project more successful? And so there's really 10 steps here, and I'm going to walk through each of these one by one. I'll let you glance through this slide. These are the first 5, but you start by defining your corporate strategy objectives. You look at your processes, your organization, your systems. You look at performance measures, and then on the back 5 or the second 5, that's where you start to identify and compare potential alternatives. You develop your roadmap. You create a business case. You develop your organizational change plan. And then, by the way, as a 10th step, you don't want to forget to hire independent outside help, companies like Third Stage that can help guide you through the process and help you define a strategy that makes the most sense for your organization. So I'm going to walk through each of these one by one. So don't panic yet, because I kind of rushed through that here to start, but I'll dive into these in a bit more detail here. So the first step is to define your corporate strategy. And sometimes when I say this to a client, they'll say, well, we already know what our corporate strategy is, or we don't really need help defining our corporate strategy. And typically that is the case. So, I mean, when I go into a client, I don't claim to know more about their industry or their company than they do. I don't claim to have a magic silver bullet type of recommendation on what their strategy should be. But instead, what I want to do is I just want to understand what it is. What are you trying to accomplish? How are you trying to be different than your competitors? What's your position in the marketplace? What are the strategic imperatives that are driving your growth and efficiency and all that kind of stuff that you're looking for? And so when you define your overall corporate strategy, one of the first things we want to do is define the big picture goals and objectives for your organization. And oftentimes we find that organizations kind of know, even if they don't have it documented, they kind of know in their heads what their strategy is. And you may not, if you're a CIO or IT manager or project manager, you may or may not fully understand what the longer term strategy is. But either way, you want to make sure you do, and make sure that you're articulating what that is, and that you're getting out of the executive team's heads what their intentions are for the company over the next, say, 3 to 5 years. And generally that's going to drive and help you define and translate into what your digital goals and objectives should be. So again, this first step is really important. I can't tell you how many companies skip this step because they think they already kind of know intuitively what the goal of the project is. Or even worse, like I said, most companies are under the gun and they have to do something pretty quickly, so they don't really worry too much about what the digital or what the corporate strategy is, that is. And so making sure you have that alignment between what the big picture goals and objectives are and what the digital goals and objectives are, that's hugely important. And that's a step that doesn't take a lot of time at all. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's such a minor part of the process in terms of man hours and effort, but it's really important. It has such a huge impact on how successful your project is or isn't going to be. So that alignment's more important than anything. And one of the key tools that I use that it's very effective, it's a visual tool to help you translate your big picture goals and objectives into what your digital goals and objectives are going to be. I use a strategy articulation map, and it's a very visual way to do it. It's something you can do in a half day or a 1 day workshop with your executive team, with your project team. Kind of, in some cases, splitting up into 2 different teams to define that. Ideally, you do it all together so you can drive some of that alignment that so many companies are missing. So that's if you'd like a sample of that, you can email me at eric@thirdstage-consulting.com, and happy to share an example with you. But that's a tool that's very effective to help you not only define what those top 5 to 7 goals and objectives for the company are, but then you start to translate what that means to my digital strategy. What types of solutions are we looking for? What type of technology is going to best help us get there? What type of business benefits are we going to expect out of this project as a result of what those corporate objectives are? All those things are going to be important. The second step is to assess your current business processes. So we'll look at we'll start with your current business processes and requirements. And we don't want to get into analysis paralysis here and over analyze and overthink our current business processes, but we do want to define what they are, where the pain points are, where the opportunities for improvement are, so that we can use that as a foundation to figure out, based on those pain points and opportunities for improvement, those prioritized pain points and opportunities for improvement, how can we from there define what the best digital strategy is to address that? So that's the context of why we want to define business processes and opportunities for improvement. We don't want to do it in the context of spending too much time on this process. And a lot of consulting companies out there will spend way too much time on this exercise, and you kind of get lost in the weeds. And oftentimes it doesn't matter too. Some of the weeds you're getting lost in it's not even really relevant to what you're going to do in the future. So you want to make sure that you focus on the highest priorities areas of your business, and also focus on the things that are going to be differentiators of the different technology options out there. So that's another reason why that third-party outside help, that independent technology agnostic help can help and assist your process, is because we can identify what are those differentiators between different systems out there. A lot of times companies will say, well, here's a set of 10 or 20 or 100 requirements that are really important to us as an organization. But when we look at it, we might say, well, okay, but only X% of those are things that would differentiate or there are significant differentiators amongst the different technology options in the marketplace. The other remainder might be things that, yes, they're important to you and they need to be captured, and we need to make sure we keep that on the radar, but they're not going to be things that are going to differentiate between different technology options that we're looking at, especially when we're at the high level here. We're not talking about choosing software yet. We're talking about what is the general digital strategy, what's the best IT strategy for our organization. So the final point's important. Make sure you don't get stuck in analysis paralysis, because once you start talking about your current processes, it's really easy to go down in the weeds and the details and overthink it, overanalyze, especially if you've got consultants who are getting paid by the hour. Sometimes they want to help you get down into that overanalysis because they make more money that way. So you want to make sure you're not getting too far down in the weeds there. So you look at first two steps were to start with your strategy, and then you look at your processes, your current processes. Third thing is to look at your current organization. And what we mean by that is looking at the people side of the equation. So we look at typically starting with a business readiness assessment. Sometimes we'll call it a transformation readiness assessment. But whatever you call it, it's an assessment that you want to undertake to look at the key aspects of your organization. Things like, what skills do you have versus what skills do you think you might need in the future going forward? And that second part is something we address later on in the strategy process. But for now, we're just looking at what skills do we have now? Where are the gaps that we have now based on what we think we should have even before we implement new technology? What is the organizational design? So in general, how are we structured? Are we structured by department, by cross-functional work group, or whatever the case may be? And we want to start to look at what are the strengths and weaknesses of how we're designed right now. And then later we look at how do we need to redesign that organization potentially to better support whatever the overall corporate and digital strategy and objectives are. And part of that kind of fits in with organizational design is also roles and responsibilities, but that's getting into more detail of who's doing what. And org design, you can think of that as kind of your org chart, but the roles and responsibilities is starting to look at individual work groups and what their job descriptions are and what their roles and responsibilities are, not just within a system, but just in general. As you look across processes, what are their different areas of expertise or things that they focus on. Then you also want to look at change impacts. So, you're setting a baseline here to identify change impacts as you define what your strategy is going forward. This is looking at the as is of what the baseline changes are going forward. You're going to look at based on these technology options or this recommended strategy. These are the gaps between what people are doing today and what they're going to be doing in the future. And it's also looking at what are those gaps between the skills they have now and the training and the current organizational design versus what that's all going to look like in the future. So we're really getting a baseline for change impacts here as we define the current state of the organization. And a lot of times we go into this exercise thinking, well, we're just getting a baseline. We're not going to define yet what that future state looks like, because that's part of this exercise is defining what the digital strategy is. And a key component of that digital strategy will be, what does the organizational change plan look like? And what does the new org design look like? What's the change impact? How do we communicate and train employees and whatnot? But a lot of times we go through this and you find that there's a lot of things that now are already outdated and inconsistent or misaligned with what the current needs are. So a lot of times you're kind of thinking 3 to 5 years out, but you're also seeing things right now that need to change as far as org design or roles and responsibilities. And to the extent you can start affecting some of those changes now, that just makes the changes a lot easier later on, because you're not force fitting a bunch of change all at once later on. Rather, you're starting to make incremental improvements along the way as you can. And then as you define more specific organizational design or roles, responsibility, or process change types of things, you can obviously continue identifying those and define what the plan is to address those along the way. So we've looked at strategy, we've looked at processes, we've looked at people. Now we look at systems and infrastructure. So, and again, we're sticking with the theme of what's the current state of the organization, because eventually we're going to, again, define what is the future state. And that's obviously the most important part. But to get there, we need to know where are we at now, how aligned is that or not with our overall strategy, and then define the options going forward. So this step of the process is looking at your current applications. What systems do you have in place? What does your physical infrastructure look like? Eventually, you're going to look at what those applications and what that infrastructure is going to need to look like in the future with the new strategy and the new alternatives. But for now, we're looking at just what do you have now? What kind of infrastructure do we have? And then later we do a gap analysis with what we need in the future. And then we also look at the skills of current business and IT employees, primarily focused on IT here. In the organizational assessment or in step 3, that's where we cover a lot of the more of the business side. But here we're looking at what kind of IT skill sets do we have on staff now? And chances are your IT organization's going to look quite a bit different in the future based on things like if you move to the cloud, if you're on premise now and you move to the cloud, or if you start to look at more of a best of breed type of solution than what you're used to, that might put more focus or need on your internal skill set surrounding solution architecture. So you might need to have more architect type people on staff versus people that are used to coding an old, mainframe system, for example. So those are the types of things we're looking at. Is what kind of skills do we have right now? And then what kind of skills do we think we're going to need in the future for the IT group? We also look at architecture and points of integration now. So we're looking at just understanding what a lot of companies will call just a spaghetti bowl, just a spaghetti diagram of all the systems that are convoluted and touching each other, and in some cases broken, and really just understanding what that current state looks like, even though you probably in some ways don't want to deal with it because it's such a mess at times. We do need to understand what that is so we can look at what systems are going away, what systems are going to stay or be replaced, what the architecture looks like going forward, and that sort of thing. And then finally, for this step here, we're also looking at data, forms, and reports. So that's, the data side, I suppose, is related more to systems and infrastructure. Forms and reports are, you could argue that's part of your business processes more so than your technology. But if we're thinking at it from a system perspective, we're looking at, what does the data look like now? Where are the gaps in the data? What can we be doing now to start cleaning up that data? And then we look at what forms and reports we have now versus what we think we're going to need in the future. So a lot of times that's an easy one for organizations to define because they have so much trouble getting the business intelligence or data they need out of the systems that, they have a pretty good sense of what their future state forms and reports might look like, or at least you can define a future state based on what you know now, knowing that as we further refine and define what that overall strategy is for the digital perspective, those forms and reports are going to improve, or not improve, but those forms and reports are going to be defined along the way. So the fifth thing then is to assess your current performance measures. So we've covered your people, your processes, your technology, your strategy with the current state. Now the fifth thing is to look at, what are your current performance measures? And it gets back to your step 1, which is that digital strategy. And a lot of times coming out of that strategy, you start to define some of the stuff as far as what the most important measures are. Oftentimes, as you're doing that strategy articulation map that I talked about, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll look at, what are the KPIs for each of those areas of the business that we're mapping out on the map, and start to get a starting point at least of what those high level measures are. But you generally would want to go down another layer of detail and start to define more at the operational level what those supporting measures and KPIs are going to look like. So you want to look at your current results for those measures. So if we know that inventory turns, for example, is something that we know we can and should improve, we want to define what it is now and then start to set targets for the future state. And again, we don't know yet what the technology is. We don't even know what the strategy is yet, but we can start to define what do we want inventory turns to look like, or top line revenue growth, or SG&A expenses as a percentage of revenue. Those are the types of things that we can start to quantify what targets the executives have in mind, and then we can start to focus the project and the digital strategy on how are we going to affect those metrics. And the other good thing with this is that it also helps you align your reporting and business intelligence. So as you're defining these business processes and the benchmarks and the metrics that you're trying to accomplish, that helps you define what your reports and business intelligence are going to look like as well. And it also acts as a foundation for your business case and your benefits realization plan. So here we're not just setting targets just to have targets or to give big fluffy numbers that make the project sound good and get people excited about the project, although that is part of the intent of doing this. But the bigger reason or the bigger benefit for doing this is that because it allows you to define not just what the business case and ROI justification for the strategy would be, but it also gives you a very specific benefits realization plan where we can actually quantify what the benefits are. We can measure results after the fact and along the way. We can hold people accountable to achieving those metrics. Those are the types of things that are important and that will help us here along the way as we're going through this process. So once we've done that initial current state of all those different areas we talked about, the strategy, the people, process, technology, and then the performance measures, now we shift gears and start looking at the future state. Now, what are those potential strategic paths that we can be following going forward? A lot of times, we're not talking specific software solutions yet, but we're talking about general paths that we might go down. So for example, we might be saying, well, based on the goals of the organization overall of wanting to standardize and scale for growth and become a more global organization with more consistent ways of doing things and better visibility across the globe, it may be that a tier 1 ERP system is the right thing for us. Or it could be that, well, we know IT isn't really our core competency and our IT costs are too high right now and we don't want to focus that much on IT. We want to be a more nimble organization. So maybe point cloud solutions are more important to us. So those first two are some of the common challenges that companies have, is that sometimes those are in conflict and sometimes they'll say, well, isn't one best practice over the other? And really it's not. It's just a matter of what your strategy is. And again, getting that alignment with what strategic paths make the most sense or are most aligned with the direction you want to go. The other third type of strategic scenario we often see as far as a alternative or an option is making incremental improvements to the current state. So a lot of times companies will say, okay, let's look at a tier one full rip and replace strategic option. Let's look at the cost benefit of that and the risk, but then compare that to just doing more incremental improvements. It might be a lower cost, lower risk option, but it might also deliver less benefit, but it might be something that's more palatable to us. But we can at least start to look at what does that scenario look like. And then oftentimes continue the status quo may not seem like a viable option. In some cases, it's really not. But for some organizations, you could just do nothing. And that's not a terrible thing to think about, is what if we just did nothing? What if we just upgraded the system we have? Or what if we just started to tweak some of the processes we have? And it could be that that's a short-term strategy, and that's okay, is to say, well, we know we're not going to do a full digital transformation for another 2 or 3 years, but in the meantime, maybe we do some process improvement or retrain people on how to use the system the way it is, or just somehow get better benefits out of the current system. So those are some of the types of options that we're looking at generally. Sometimes when we're doing this, though, we'll get to the point where, hey, it's pretty clear that one of these paths is really the general direction we're going to go. So now the alternatives really come down to, well, let's start to look at specific technologies that could fit into that. For example, a lot of times we'll go through and find that one of those first 2 bullet points, tier 1 system or point cloud solutions right in the middle of your screen, a lot of times companies will say one of those is probably the best for us, so let's just focus on that. In that case, we can start to look at, all right, well, let's look at SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, see what the cost benefit would be for you, and start to define what the ROI and what the risk implications might mean there. And I say here that you don't need to choose specific software yet, but the reality is that a lot of times companies are ready to get there and they want to do that as part of the strategic assessment here. So you don't need to, but you can. It just depends on how much time you want to spend here in this strategic planning phase. I really enjoy doing it to where you actually go through the strategy. You're defining different strategic alternatives, and then you're along the way or at the same time defining what the specific software solutions might be too. It's just a good way to get to that next layer of detail if you've got the time and the resources to do that. And then when you get into the actual decision, that it just speeds up the evaluation and selection process for choosing software. And so now we're ready to look at, okay, what's our 3 to 5 year roadmap? What is our strategy? What are we going to do? Are we going to roll out that big ERP system? Are we going to do it best of breed? Are we just going to slowly take out bite-sized chunks to implement new point solutions along the way? Are we just going to do process improvements? Or is it a combination of all these different things? whatever it is, we want to start to define what is that 3 to 5 year roadmap. We're defining order of magnitude timelines and milestones. Generally, when we go in, we've done this so many times and we have that hands-on implementation experience that we can provide very good ranges of how much time and resource and cost, risk it'll take to pursue whatever option that we're recommending. We also want to look at high-level cost, benefits, and ROI. So here's where we start to look at what is that return on investment if we do go down that path. And then we also look at the risk of the overall strategy. What is the risk implications of going through it? What is the alignment with corporate goals and objectives? And that's actually, those are evaluation criteria that we look at when we're looking at alternatives in step 6 that we just talked about, is we're doing kind of a risk assessment of each of these alternatives. Then we do a level of alignment. We actually measure, what is that alignment level with corporate strategy? And some alternatives are going to be better aligned with that than others. Some are going to have more risk than others. Some are going to have a better ROI than others. And so you look at that entire picture in its totality, and that's what gives you that recommendation of what that 3 to 5 year roadmap might be. And then we create that business case and the benefits realization plan. It's a separate step here, but it really is part of that step 7 where we define the 3 to 5 year roadmap. Typically the roadmap includes what is the business case, what is the benefits realization plan. So here's where we're defining those potential benefits. We're creating a plan to realize the business benefits. We're including specific metrics and ownership along the way. We're looking at alignment with specific technology functionality. So if we know what specific software or what specific types of software we're going to be implementing, we can be looking at what is the alignment with those goals and objectives and those functional needs. And then we also look at alignment with business processes and organizational design. So when we look at the overall plan and the overall alternative and roadmap, we want to understand what the alignment with the business processes and the organizational design or people side of the equation are. And then we look at developing an organizational change plan. And I've included just a really high level roadmap or framework for how we approach organizational change. There's 6 major components that we look at in terms of addressing from the time we define a strategy for an organization, through the time we select specific software, through the time we plan for an implementation, and through the time that we actually implement and realize benefits. So these 6 areas actually start typically during the strategy phase, and they continue all the way through and after implementation and post go live. But in general, there's a few things you're doing. One is you're assessing along the way, what is our transformation readiness? What's our change and skill impact? We're looking at ownership. How do we ensure that internally we have ownership of this project and the processes and the technologies that will evolve over time? And so we do that by establishing a change lead and change agents, the internal change network, a center of excellence. There's a lot we do there to ensure ownership along the way. And then we look at alignment. So what is the alignment of the organization and where are the points of misalignment so we can fix that? Oftentimes the misalignment on the people side, where an organization is designed in a way that doesn't support the way we're trying to roll out these process and technology changes, we've got to realign the organization, redesign the organization, define new roles and responsibilities. And then we look at agility, organizational agility. How do we ensure continuous learning, flexible organizational competency? Those are the things that we want to embed in the organization. There's also a cultural component there. How do we start to shift the needle on what the culture is versus what we want it to be? All that equates to agility, and those are all things that take time and should start during the strategy phase and continue. And then there's acknowledgement, and that's really just the acknowledgement of employees of what the changes are and their buy-in and ownership of those changes. So that's where communications, training comes into play. And then performance. Ultimately, we're doing organizational change management to drive performance. And we're doing all of this to drive performance, by the way, not just the change management side, but the overall digital strategy. So we need to understand what the benefits realization plan is and performance management to help us drive those performance improvements and the ROIs that we expect to see from the project. So develop that organizational change plan early on, and that should be embedded in the overall strategy. And this is where we start to define how are we going to do these 6 different work streams or different work threads of change. and what are the specific tasks and activities and resources that we're going to embed in our digital strategy to address the people side of the equation. And then finally, this isn't really a sequential thing. It's just something to consider along the way, and it kind of weaves in and out throughout the 9 steps that we talked about, which is make sure you don't forget to hire independent outside help. I mean, a lot of this stuff you can try to do on your own, but it's going to be a lot more effective and efficient if you have that outside help. Usually it's going to save you a lot of time and money to make sure that you understand the digital landscape and that to help you define the best strategy for you. You want to look at a flexible consulting model that consults based on your needs. So we have a plethora of tools and methods and things that we use as an organization, but we don't force fit that into an organization. We work with the parameters that you have in place. You may be the type of culture where you want to own the project and you're driving the project, and we're more of an advisory role. You may be the type that's growing so fast that you don't have a lot of resources to commit to defining and implementing your strategy. So in that case, we can take more of a lead role on it. So there's a lot of different ways that you can structure consulting engagements to fit your culture, your needs, your budget, all that good stuff. And then you also want to make sure at this stage, especially, and even all the way through software selection and implementation as well, quite frankly, you want to make sure that your consultant is 100% unaffiliated with software vendors and resellers. So I talked earlier about how we have 2 values as an organization. One is independence, and one of the others I talked about was the collaboration with the industry. So you want people that are unaffiliated on one hand, but you also want people that aren't disliked by the industry. And unfortunately, there's a lot of consulting firms out there that are disliked by the industry, and that creates problems for them, and it kind of unintentionally biases their view of the marketplace and limits their effectiveness in working with clients. So that wraps up the 10 steps, and we're kind of coming up on the top of the hour here where we get to the Q&A portion. But before I get into questions, I wanted to invite you to learn more via our 3rd stage thought leadership. So again, for those of you that are used to reading my blogs or white papers or webinars and that sort of thing, that is all now on the 3rd stage consulting site. So encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Make sure you're getting up-to-date weekly updates on what our thought leadership is, and encourage you to go to the website and really just dig around and learn from it as much as you can. It's got a lot of great resources that the intent is to help you get your project started and give you some best practices to guide you through your entire digital transformation, whether we're talking about your initial strategy or helping you with software selection or helping you figure out how to implement all this stuff. That's what the thought leadership is focused on there. So at this point, we'll dive into questions. And while we're doing that, I'm going to pull up what questions you have here. I'm going to leave out my contact information here. So if there's anything you'd like to reach out to me for, whether it's questions we don't get to here today, or whether it's to learn more about 3rd stage or how we can help your organization, feel free to reach out to me. You've got my cell phone number here, my email address. You can also follow me on Twitter or connect with me on LinkedIn as well. So a couple other things here that I'll throw in is, I'm going to dive into questions. I'm not going to throw in anything other than an answer to some of these questions. But if you haven't submitted any questions yet, feel free to do so on the chat tab here, and I'll see these questions as they come up here. So first question here is, who should own a project like this? IT? And I guess that's a tough question. I mean, I'd say in a perfect world, you don't want IT to own it necessarily, and I hope I don't offend those of you that are in IT, the CIOs and IT directors on the webinar here today. But generally, you want the business to own it, and you want IT, and the IT director, CIO, obviously should be a part of the steering committee and the key core part of the project. But you really want the business to own this, because if you outsource this to IT and treat it like a hardware infrastructure update or some of the other things that IT typically does, you're not going to have the right level of ownership and buy-in and support that you need. And that's where you're more likely to get that misalignment that we talked about up front. So making sure that your business owns the project is important. And again, IT should be involved, but you really want your business owning it. And when you think about what ownership means, it's also things like making decisions around what your operating model is going to be. How are your business processes going to look? Oftentimes the change impacts mean that we're changing jobs. We're redesigning the organization. We're redesigning roles and responsibilities. So you need to have the business involved. You typically need to have HR involved because you're talking about changing processes and jobs. So that's why the business side is even more important than IT. And IT is obviously an enabler and a facilitator of the whole process, but you don't want to cross that too far down the line of outsourcing everything to IT when the business should be owning it. Another question in comment here is, great webinar. Have you worked with chemical companies, and is innovation management a major challenge? Thank you for the compliments on the webinar. We appreciate that. And have you worked with chemical companies? Yes, yes, we have. There's a number of, one was a fertilizer chemical company. There's actually a very big global digital strategy we laid out for them. And we also implemented one of the tier 1 ERP solutions for them a few years ago. And then a couple other different chemical companies. That's the one that came to mind because I was personally very involved in that project with our team. And then in addition to chemical companies, we've also worked a lot with food and beverage, which a little bit different industry and market, obviously, but it's very similar processes in terms of the process manufacturing and some of the regulatory types of things. But the process manufacturing side with beverage, especially, a lot of times you see a lot of best practices that are shared between chemical and beverage. Although in reality, obviously you don't want to mix chemicals and food as much as you can. So yes, we do work with chemical companies. And then a follow-up question here from the same person was, are many chemical companies choosing to go through digital transformation? And I'd say yes. I mean, I don't really know of any industries that aren't necessarily going through digital transformation. Obviously, some in the industry are further along than others, and some are further behind. But in general, most industries as a whole are trying to figure out, what does a digital transformation look like for us? Is it just an ERP project? Is it looking at technology in general? Are we starting to look at Internet of Things and e-commerce and workforce management and advanced planning and CRM, HCM, all these different technologies that can do more than just basic back office ERP. I mean, that's the big challenge, and the $1 million question is, what's right for you as an organization? How much of a leap do you want to make? How far ahead do you want to get of your competition? Are you just trying to keep up? Those are all the kinds of things you have to think about. Another question here is, how long should a digital transformation take? It's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for you because it's really an open-ended thing that I would say probably never really ends. I mean, you obviously don't want a never-ending project that becomes a money pit and you can't get any benefits out of it. But let's assume you do it well, you do it on time, on budget, you get the benefits you expect. You don't want to just be done with your digital transformation after, say, 2, 3, 5 years or whatever it is. You want to be continuously improving and looking at how can technology continuously how can we upgrade that technology and continuously improve our organization, tweak our processes, rethink our organization and the way we're organized. So all that stuff should be really an ongoing process. And that's why a big part of what we do for organizations is help them implement a center of excellence, where that center of excellence is really becoming the foundation for internal ownership and continuous improvement of the organization along the way. Okay, another question here is slide 6 specifically calls out tier 1 ERP systems. Should not one consider those ERP systems whose functionality best fits the industry? I am thinking metals, from hot end to service centers and fabrication. Yeah, and I don't, I guess I want to make sure I understand your question. I'm not suggesting that you don't necessarily consider tier 1 systems. I'm not saying you do or don't, actually. I think it just depends on, how clear that path is. So if you clearly have a path that a tier 1 system is really the only good option you have, which for a lot of companies it is, especially if you're a larger organization. I know I've done a lot of work in the metal industry. I've worked with several different, very large steel and metal related companies. And for them, a lot of times a tier 1 system is the best solution just because of the unique needs of the industry. And a lot of times these are, for the ones I've worked with anyway, were bigger organizations that needed that tier 1 focus. So yeah, you do want to look at ERP systems whose functionality best fits the industry. But what I'm saying is, if you don't know, or you're maybe more of a mid-sized organization that doesn't have super unique needs where you do have more options and flexibility in what you do, that's where maybe you don't start to look at specific software yet. You look at more, for example, a tier 1 versus a tier 2 system versus a best of breed. Those could be 3 options right there, or 3 paths that you consider. And then you decide which path is most likely the one you want to go down. In some cases you hedge and you say, well, we'll look at tier 1 and maybe a couple tier 2s, and you do kind of a hybrid model. But in general, I'd say, yeah, if for the metal industry, a lot of times it is true what you're saying, that you have tier 1 systems or the bigger ERP systems that are the better fit for them, then that can certainly be an option you define at this point. And then you start to shift gears and focus more on the implementation sooner than later. All right, we're almost at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to take a couple more questions. These are great questions, by the way, so thank you, and keep them coming. And if I don't get to them, feel free to reach out after the fact. But the next one is, who makes the decision on software? Is it the CXOs or the IT managers? I'd say it's both, but it's not just the IT managers and the CXOs. It's also the key stakeholders and users that are providing input into the process. Now, obviously, the CXOs and IT managers combined, I'd say, need to make that decision. Generally, if there's an impasse or it's not a clear decision, which often, honestly, usually it is pretty clear. I mean, when we go through an evaluation with clients, usually there's one that just kind of rises to the top as a clear best fit for organization. But if for some reason there's not a good fit, or there's 2 that are really good fits that are kind of equal, at that point, you'd want to make sure your executive sponsor, who ideally is from the business, whether it's the CFO or COO or whatever the case may be, ideally that person would be the ultimate decision maker. And that's the person who would ensure that whatever the decision is aligned with the overall corporate strategy as well. All right. Well, that takes us right to the top of the hour. I want to thank you all for your questions. Thank you for attending here today. I hope you found this useful. I'm going to send an automated email here in about 3 hours that will include a link to the replay of this. So if you missed any part of it, you want to hear it again or share it with anyone you work with that may have missed today's session, feel free to forward that email on to your team. Thank you again for joining. You can learn more about us on our website, thirdstage-consulting.com. Hope to see you on future webinars, and have a good rest of your day in the meantime. Thank you.
On behalf of SoftExpert, thank you for the presence of everyone who participated in this event. If you have any questions, please contact the presenter via email. To see other webinars, ebooks, and white papers on this subject, please visit our website at www.softexpert.com. Find out more about SoftExpert solutions for enterprise business processes improvement, automation, corporate governance, excellence, and compliance management. Thanks for listening. See you next time.